Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by thanking the sponsor of today's episode, Simply Tudor Tours. Their exclusive Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn tour this September offers an immersive experience that blends learning and living history. Your hosts, Sarah Morris from the Tudor Travel Guide and Adam Pennington from the Tudor Chest, will be joined by guest historian in residence Estelle Peronk. Together, they will weave the threads of Anne's rise and fall as they move between some of the most pivotal locations associated with her story. Highlights include 2 nights at Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's beloved childhood home, where you'll not only enjoy a behind-the-scenes tour, but also a feast in the Great Hall, serenaded by Tudor minstrels and presided over by a very special royal guest. You'll need to be on your best behaviour. They'll also visit Windsor Castle, Hampton Court, Westminster Abbey, and the foreboding Tower of London. Get ready to pull back the veil of time and touch history for yourself. With only 3 spots available, don't delay. Check out their website for more information on this tour over at simplytudortours.com. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Jack Beesley back to the show to talk about his research into early modern sexuality and sodomy legislation in early modern England. Please note that in this episode we discuss adult themes and use terminology of the time. Listener discretion is advised. Jack Beesley is a doctoral candidate at Manchester Metropolitan University, specialising in early modern sexuality. Specifically, his research investigates the representation of, quote, sodomy, unquote, as a national threat within satirical texts produced during the reign of King William III, and its impact on the growing awareness and persecution of sodomitical subcultures. Jack's works featured as the cover story for History Today in September 2024 and has been disseminated through multiple podcast appearances. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome back to Talking Tudors, Jack. How are you?
Really well, thank you. Thank you for having me back. It's been so long.
It has been so long, I know. I'm very excited to talk to you again. So before we get into our conversation, could you please just introduce yourself to everyone? Just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
My name is Jack. I'm a third-year PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University, studying sexuality in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Fabulous. We are going to be talking about the 17th century, but also Tudor England as well. So you specialise in early modern sexuality, and today we thought we'd talk about attitudes towards same-sex relationships in the 16th or 17th centuries as well. So let's start with sodomy, the word sodomy. How was that actually understood by medieval and early modern people?
So I think the first factor to consider is that homosexuality as we understand it today didn't exist until the late 19th century. So the terms homosexuality and heterosexuality were created as part of the medicalization of human sexuality, setting homosexual men apart and reducing them to a scientific and criminal minority. So although same-sex relationships have always existed, the male homosexual is a distinctly modern identity category. So people before the late 19th and early 20th centuries understood sexual relationships between men very differently. So to understand really how medieval and early modern people understood same-sex relationships, it's important to begin with the Sodom story, I think, in Genesis chapter 19 and its significance, which of course is where sodomy actually gets its name. But I'll go over that in a second. So just to familiarize the Sodom story quickly, it was a city represented along with its neighbor Gomorrah as extremely wicked. Due to its reputation, God wants to learn the truth about Sodom's sinful inhabitants and sends two angels to the city. They were met at the gate by Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. So he presses the angels to accept his hospitality, but that night his house was beset by Sodom's inhabitants, who were known as called the Sodomites, who demanded that the angels be brought out to them so that they might know them. And this has been interpreted to mean something sexual. So Lot attempts to deter the crowd and offered up his daughters instead. And the Sodomites were eventually stopped by the angels who blinded them. So the next morning, Lot and his family were guided out of the city and God destroyed it with brimstone and fire. So the Old Testament really depicts Sodom as a symbol of total destruction and its sin of one of such enormity that it merited divine punishment. But nowhere does it actually identify that sin explicitly with sex between men. So further biblical texts actually provide insight into the sins of the Sodomites. So for example, in Ezekiel chapter 16, it says that Sodom's sin was pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness. So actually there's arguments that the sins of the Sodomites were arrogance, lack of hospitality, and being uncharitable. But this is where it gets interesting. From the 2nd century onwards, Christian tradition associated the story of Sodom and Gomorrah with same-sex practices, so much so that sex between men was referred to as the sodomitic sin or in the sodomitic manner before the term sodomy was coined. So this brings me on to the actual term sodomy, which emerged in Peter Damian's Book of Gomorrah in around 1051. So Damian was a Benedictine monk and theologian who addressed his booklet to Pope Leo IX or 10th. The booklet offered different arguments against a sin that was most often cited as the sodomitic vice that was once referred to as sodomy. So Damian highlighted the vice's 4 types, which he identified as self-pollution, mutual grasping or rubbing of manly parts, pollution between the thighs, and fornication in the rear. So these sexual acts are ordered in terms of their increasing offence. And Damian's concern in writing his booklet was the sexual deviancy that was allegedly occurring behind the walls of the monasteries. So sodomy was actually a theological category which Damian coined to group together and obviously denounce a series of sexual acts which could be traced back to the sinful inhabitants of Sodom and their divine destruction. So I think it's important to note that unlike homosexuality, which refers to sexual orientation and a person's sense of identity based on sexual attraction, sodomy was a term which assembled different sexual acts that were seen as sexually deviant. So it's really important to note that these acts were not exclusively related to sex between men, but could also refer to non-reproductive sex between men and women as well. So in a complete contrast to how we think about sexuality today, up until the 18th century, really, no one thought that their choice of sexual partner had anything to do with who they were. So sexual identity and orientation didn't yet exist as concepts. So instead, sodomy was understood as a sinful temptation that could entice all men. So for example, John Reynolds, who was a Tudor churchman, noted that sodomy was a sin to which men's natural corruption and viciousness is prone. And this is really the most important dynamic to same-sex behaviour in the Middle Ages and much of the early modern period. It wasn't believed to be limited to a distinguishable or identifiable minority of men, like homosexuality is today, but was instead considered this universal temptation to all men. So Peter Damian actually believed the threat of temptation of sodomy to be so monumental that he feared a shadow hierarchy in the church of sodomitical bishops who protected sodomitical priests, who in turn would corrupt their congregation. So Damian actually urges the Pope to remove all clergymen who committed sodomy to avoid this, which was highly impractical. But his booklet was successful in that church officials did begin to follow Damian's advice and expunge the church and secular communities of sodomy. So the English court of William II actually became a particular cause for concern in the 1090s.
And so, how then and why do the first anti-sodomy laws get introduced into England?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. The start of this process can be seen during the reign of William II, who I just mentioned. So William's three principal chroniclers, I hope I pronounced these right, because I'm not a medievalist, but Eadmer of Canterbury, William of Malmesbury, and Orderic Vitalis all agreed that his private life was debauched, and some cited sodomy as the reason for that debauchery. So Malmesbury noted that William's court was a brothel of mature male prostitutes, and Vitalis complained that the king's courtiers shamelessly gave themselves up to the filth of sodomy. He labelled the king's court a group of foul catamites and effeminates who were doomed to eternal fire. Interestingly, Eadmer's History of Recent Events in England from around 1115 recounts a heated argument between Archbishop Anselm, I think that's how you pronounce it, and William II. So Anselm wanted to convene a general council of bishops to tackle sodomy, which he said had lately spread abroad in this land and with its abomination defiled many. So he wants to essentially team up with William and form a general council to establish a decree against sodomy, because that hadn't happened before in England. He also had a discussion with William about the debauched reputation of his court, in which William blushed and became infuriated. So William actually refuses to allow this general council to be convened. So at this point in England, sodomy was a sin, but not a crime. But the wheels had been set in motion to make it one. So William II was killed during a hunt in the New Forest by an arrow shot in 1100. The circumstances of his death, whether he was assassinated or whether it was an accident, remain debated. But now, with William out of the way, Anselm was free to convene his church council against sodomy. So the first piece of English ecclesiastical legislation, which referred to sodomy as a crime, was the 1102 Council of London. So the decree takes action to see that the public was informed of the indecency of the sodomite abomination, as they called it, and insisted that it be confessed as a sin. So that the average Englishman was not already aware of this isn't only implied by the wording of the edict, but affirmed by Anselm, who stated this sin has hitherto been so public that hardly anyone is embarrassed by it, and may therefore fallen into it because they were unaware of its seriousness. He might be referencing the court of William II here, or just talking more generally. So this reveals really that for the everyday people of England at this point, sodomy was likely not considered to be a serious problem. Only those who had the time and aptitude to reflect on it, such as theologians and churchmen, became concerned with its severity. Despite this, actually, the decree of 1102 was prohibited from publication by Anselm. The stated reason for its suppression was that it had been drafted too quickly and required revisions. And writing 50 years later, John of Salisbury invoked the prohibitions of the emperor against sodomy, presumably referring to the Code of Justinian from 534. So he didn't refer to any English ecclesiastical legislation on the subject, which suggests that the 1102 decree was never published. So sex between men was still not, at this point, a punishable crime in England. So it wasn't until 1290, in an early treatise on the common law of England called Fleta, that an actual penalty for sodomy was decreed. It was most likely composed by a jurist at the court of Edward I. So the treatise stated that sodomists are to be buried alive after legal proof that they were taken in the act. It's highly unlikely that buried alive was ever enforced against those who committed sodomy in England, not least because there's no actual record of it ever happening. And actually only a few copies of Fleta survive, which suggests that it was never widely read by medieval lawyers. But another treatise known as Britain, which was based on Fleta, survives in dozens of manuscripts, meaning that it was probably much better known. So written in Anglo-Norman French, Britain is thought to have been created by order of Edward I and was part of codifying English law. It's here that the customary penalty for sodomy was actually decreed, which was burning. Britain also established how sodomy could be prosecuted. So it states how the ecclesiastical courts were generally responsible for the trials of those accused of sodomy, while the function of the secular court was to enforce the penalty on those who had been convicted by the church, if that makes sense. It also states that the king's court had the power to act independently. So burning was most likely the standard attitude to the punishment of sodomy as laid out in Britain. However, unlike other countries such as Italy, this theory wasn't put into practice in England. In fact, court evidence is almost completely silent about sodomy. So too is medieval English literature. So this brings us back to the belief that sodomy was a universal threat. It was considered more than just a sexual sin like adultery. It had deep theological implications due to its supposed connection with Sodom, which likened it with rebellion against God. So we might think that this belief would ensure the strict enforcement of the law against sodomy, but in fact it achieved the opposite. In England, at least, sodomy became unmentionable and was referred to across Europe as the unmentionable sin.
And so, what were the implications of it being viewed in this particular way?
There's a few sources that kind of reveal this. So according to the Revelation of the Monk of Eynsham, which is a late 12th century Latin text and was read in England until the 16th century, the worst of sexual sins is unmentionable by a Christian or even by a heathen or pagan. Similarly, in the Book of Vices and Virtues, which was a late 14th century English translation of Some of the King, which was a French text of religious and moral instruction, the last of the 7 deadly sins is known as a sin against kind. So it says that this sin is not to be spoken, for the matter is so foul that it is an abomination to speak it. So these texts reveal the practice of silence. So talk of sodomy wasn't only forbidden because of its theological implications, but also because it was considered the most tempting of sexual sins. There was this perceived danger of temptation in even naming sodomy, unless it gives people ideas. But because of the practice of silence, cases that reached the courts were limited to what Thomas Aquinas, an Italian friar priest, called natural lust. So this included adultery, fornication, and prostitution. Only occasionally were people charged with sodomy, which was, called the unnatural crime, things like that. So between 1470 and 1516, only one man from over 21,000 defendants in London was accused of sodomy. So this was I believe in 1471, and he was called William Smith, and he publicly preached that he had committed a sodomitic crime with Thomas Tomley. However, the case was dropped by the court before a decision was reached. And then one of the few other cases concerning sodomy in medieval England was that of John/Eleanor Rykener. So this is actually a really, really interesting case. So Rykener was a biological male who engaged in sex work while dressed as a woman. Rykener also worked as an embroideress and tapster, which were typical modes of women's labour in the period. So Rykener was eventually arrested after being caught with a client called John Britby in Soppers Lane. So only Rykener's Latin interrogation survived, which used the phrases detestable, unmentionable, and ignominious vice, unspeakable act, and abominable vice. So actually, unlike other European jurisdictions who actually use the term sodomy, Rykener's confession avoided it completely. There is also no record of an explicit charge, verdict, or sentence of the case, so we don't know what happened to Rykener. I get the feeling from the Latin interrogation that the authorities just didn't really know what to do. They hadn't seen something like this before, so they didn't know how to approach it. But what these cases demonstrate is that England maintained the practice of silence even when directly confronted with the matter of sodomy. So the hesitation of the English courts to prosecute sodomy meant that sex between men was actually fairly low risk in medieval and Tudor England. Those who committed sodomy could hide behind the silence. So in other European cities where the practice of silence wasn't adhered, the situation was very, very different. So, for example, sodomy in 15th century Florence was recognized as one of the city's most urgent moral and social problems. A friar and preacher at the time claimed that the Florentines owed their sodomitical infamy to the fact that they talked and chatted so much about the vice, about sodomy. So to suppress it, the government actually created a kind of police force in 1432 called the Office of the Knight, which was created just to prosecute sodomy. So during its 70-year duration from 1432 to 1502, it's estimated that as many as 17,000 individuals in a city of around 40,000 were implicated at least once for sodomy, with close to 3,000 being convicted. And I think Leonardo da Vinci was one of those individuals, not actually convicted, but found. So the practice of silence, although a method of repression, actually protected sodomites from conviction in England. But things start to change with the English Reformation because it ushers in changes to how sodomy was prosecuted. So coming to the Tudors now, as part of Henry VIII's dismantlement of church power, sodomy was removed from the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts and committed to the civil magistrates instead. So the previous lack of punishment for sodomy in England was actually acknowledged with the introduction of the Buggery Act in 1533. So this act states, "For as much as there is not yet sufficient and condign punishment appointed and limited by the due course of the laws of this realm for the detestable and abominable vice of buggery committed with mankind or beast, the offenders being hereof convicted by verdict, confession, or outlawry shall suffer pains of death." So this was actually England's first civil sodomy law, which made sex between men punishable by death, presumably by hanging. It doesn't actually say what method, but presumably by hanging. So the Act goes through changes with the different religious policies implemented by Mary I and Elizabeth I. So the Act was actually repealed during Mary's reign as part of her rejection of Henry VIII's break with Rome, and no steps were taken to introduce further legislation against sodomy. This was likely because such offences were intended to be restored to the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts if Mary's return to Catholicism had been successful. But the accession of Elizabeth ushers in yet another change to England's religious policy. So Elizabeth's second parliament in 1563 revives the statute of 1533 and made it to be in full force, strength and effect forever. So the Act actually then remains active for the next 3 centuries. And it's under this that men were eventually prosecuted and executed until the death penalty for sodomy was abolished in 1861. But these executions don't really take off until the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So in Tudor England, sodomy still went largely unpunished. Only one man during the Tudor era, as far as I'm aware, in England was executed for sodomy. So this was Walter Hungerford, first Baron Hungerford, who was actually executed alongside Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's chief minister. So the main charge against Hungerford was treason, and it's likely that the sodomy charge was included to add further weight to the case against him. So similarly to the Middle Ages, offences associated with sex between men were not a high priority in Tudor England. Sodomy remained unmentionable. So it's really difficult to find evidence of same-sex relationships in Tudor England.
Yeah, that's also fascinating. And I think, Jack, probably our listeners have, if they've, read some books about Tudor England, some fiction especially, may have come across a suggestion or conversation about George Boleyn's sexuality. So George, of course, was Anne Boleyn's brother. So can you tell us a little bit about the sort of rumours circulating about George's sexuality and really whether it's grounded in any kind of contemporary evidence?
Yeah. This is a really, really interesting case. And I think, like most rumours about the sexuality of historic figures, it's really difficult to form solid conclusions about. Yeah, like you just said, I'm sure all your listeners are aware who George was, Anne Boleyn's brother, executed on charges of incest in 1536. But as far as I'm aware, there is no contemporary evidence or rumour that George Boleyn had same-sex relationships. This idea first emerged in Aretha Warnocke's book in the 1980s, where she hypothesized that George had been sexually or romantically involved with the palace musician Mark Smeaton, who was the lowest born of those executed for adultery with Anne Boleyn. But the idea that George, what we would now recognize as gay or bisexual, has never really gone away in modern dramatizations. He's almost always depicted that way. So the Tudors TV show, which started in 2007, is probably the most well-known of these depictions, where George is shown to be having a passionate affair with Smeaton. I'll go through the theories about George's sexuality in a second, but before I do, I just want to clarify that I'm not quote unquote defending him from these accusations. There's this idea that to be gay is an insult, and that's still very much with us. And we can see this in how people react when a historic figure, either rightly or wrongly, are posited to be gay. So if we look at James VI and First, or William III, for example, who is the subject of my PhD, there's been such a movement to defend these kings from the contemporary rumour and accusations surrounding their same-sex activity, as though their achievements and success as monarchs would somehow be diminished if they did have same-sex affairs. James certainly, I think, had sexual relationships with men, and in my opinion, William was at the very least sexually attracted to other men. But historians demand an impossibly high burden of proof for historic same-sex relationships, in contrast to the limited amounts of evidence that are required for heterosexual affairs. So, for example, Mary Boleyn's alleged affair with Henry VIII is widely accepted despite being based on such limited evidence. I think there's just a few sentences written by a Catholic prior and an MP from the time. if the tables were turned and there was just a few sentences written about Henry VIII having a same-sex affair, it wouldn't be given credibility at all. So there's this kind of double standard applied to historic accounts of sexuality that I just wanted to highlight, in which someone suspected of a same-sex affair is seemingly always defended from the accusation. I don't think we need to defend figures like George from these rumours. We just need to look at the evidence and judge if it does actually point to him having a same-sex affair or not. So yeah, like I mentioned, the rumour first appears in Warnke's The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn from 1989. So the fact that it began in a secondary work, I think, should already raise some eyebrows. But Warnke based her theory on 4 grounds. So firstly, a poem called Metrical Visions by George Cavendish, who was a gentleman usher to Cardinal Wolsey. Secondly, George's scaffold speech. Thirdly, the fact that George lent or gave a book to Mark Smeaton that was a satire on marriage and an attack on women. And 4, the likelihood that George's marriage to Jane Rochford was childless. So with regards to 3 and 4, I think we can refute them quite easily. To presume that a couple's childlessness is a result of the husband's sexual attraction to men is highly speculative. George and Jane may have been unable to have children, or there is just no record of Jane's pregnancies. She could have had miscarriages, for example, which weren't recorded. This also presents quite a very linear and simplistic view of sexuality. We've got James VI, for example, who had 7 children with his wife, despite his affairs with men. And Edward II, another English monarch who had same-sex affairs, had 5 children. So also marriages between the elite and what goes on in them aren't really an indication of a person's sexuality at all. Marriage was about dynasty and alliances and had nothing to do with a couple's happiness or attraction for one another. So on the flip side, even if George and Jane did have children, it still wouldn't be indicative of his sexuality. He was the sole heir to, at one point, the most significant family in England, the sole male, sorry. So it was his duty to provide children. So I wouldn't use George's marriage and the couple's childlessness as evidence for his sexual preferences. So with the satirical book, Mocking Marriage, that George gave to Smeaton, I think it was a 13th century satirical poem that also attacked women and was actually widely circulated amongst scholars in Europe. So passing it from hand to hand was completely normal. That's how writing spread during this period. So I believe that George actually wrote in this particular copy that he gave to Smeaton, and so did Thomas Wyatt. So it was something that was clearly doing the rounds amongst this circle of courtiers at Henry's court. So Warnke's speculation that this passing over of a satire was a sign of intimacy between the two is really quite the leap, to say the least. The fact that we can see that it was passed around from courtier to courtier, I think, removes the intimacy of Warnke's theory. But now, moving on to George's scaffold speech and Cavendish's poem, this is where I think the speculation actually does gain some merit. So in his speech, which was lengthy, George refers to himself as a wretched sinner and a perverse sinner who is grievously and oftentimes offended and is deserving of death. George refused to relate what these sins were because he said that God knoweth them all. Cavendish's poem is actually an interpretation of what George could be referring to here. So in his poem, Cavendish relates that George's life was bestial, that he forced widows and deflowered maidens, and that his appetite was all women to devour and that he spared none at all. So this part of the poem clearly relates to women and presents George as a sexual predator whose sexual encounters were not always consensual. As a queer historian, the part of the poem that intrigues me the most is the last verse, where Cavendish goes on to say that the sin which George restrains to confess is an abomination that all the world infect. It is so vile, so detestable in words to express, for which by the law condemned I am doubtless, and for my desert justly judged to be dead. The wording here is entirely in keeping with how sodomy was spoken about at the time. So it was believed infectious. The word detestable was almost always used as a precursor to mention sodomy, like in the Buggery Act. And it was thought of as something unmentionable, like we've covered. It was called the unmentionable sin. So this could be why Cavendish says that words can't express how bad this particular sin was that George committed. But like I mentioned, sodomy or buggery were not terms that were exclusive to sex between men. They could also mean a variety of sexual acts that were seen as sinful, including various acts between men and women. So this could be a further iteration of the excessive womanizing that Cavendish earlier accused George of. But it's rare to see sex between a man and a woman referred to as an abomination or detestable, no matter what form it took. Remember I mentioned that adultery, fornication, and prostitution were known as natural lust. So if something is described as an abomination, it would suggest that the act was viewed as unnatural. So in my research, I've only really seen this wording used when sex between men has been the topic of discussion. So when I was looking at this, I was thinking, could Cavendish instead be referring to the incest accusations for which George and Anne were condemned? That seems possible because he says that by the law, George has been condemned for these sins. The part that makes me hesitant, though, is Cavendish saying that George was justly judged. So if he was referring to the incest between George and Anne, he is saying here that that was true. This strikes me as odd because Cavendish actually steadfastly claimed that Anne remained a virgin up until her marriage to Henry. And he also upheld her sexual morals when other Catholic authors graphically criticised her sexuality. So could Cavendish instead be referring to the Buggery Act when he mentions the law, inferring that George deserves death for committing acts that were forbidden by the Act? I think if we don't interpret this passage as literal, i.e. that detestable and unspoken sins were the actual ones that George was condemned for at his trial, then this could make sense. So obviously, of course, George wasn't condemned under the Buggery Act, nor were any of the other men he was executed with. But Cavendish could be saying here that George was doubtless guilty and deserved death for his sexual depravity, which, as well as being a serial predator of women, also included abominations like sodomy. So actually, this wouldn't have been a far reach for contemporary audiences at all, who understood sodomy as a depraved temptation. So to a man who abuses women and whose sexual appetite is out of control, as described by Cavendish, sodomy is simply the next step that this man would take in his journey of sexual depravity. And audiences at the time, I think, would have understood that. It's also really intriguing to me that in the verse where Cavendish discusses George deflowering maidens, etc., the language is really plain and uncensored. There is no mistaking what he's referring to here. But in the verse that I've just described, the language is so ambiguous that it could mean a variety of things. And this is extremely common when writers of the early modern period were referring to sodomy. So they could refer to it, but they never actually said the word sodomy. So just as an example, in one of the poems that I work with in my PhD discusses William III, and the author says that when King William ruled this land, a monarch of great fame for mercy, justice, and a thing which here I dare not name. So here the author is undoubtedly referring to sodomy. And there is a parallel, I think, between this and Cavendish saying that George's sins couldn't be expressed in words. So sodomy was that unspeakable sin. So the fact that Cavendish can't express George's sexual sins leads me to think that he is referring to sodomy in this passage. However, this is obviously just one source written years after George's death. So if we were to credibly argue that George had same-sex affairs, then we would need accusations and other sources from his lifetime. These are admittedly really, really hard to come by for the reasons that I've already mentioned. The reason why I'm studying sexuality in the 17th and 18th centuries is because sources are so scarce in earlier periods. But that, of course, doesn't mean that these relationships weren't happening. They just weren't recorded or records were actually destroyed. But you would think that if Cavendish's claims were true, even his assertion that George abused women, then someone like Eustace Chapuis, who hated the Boleyns,
that's what I was just thinking,
would have made some note of it. Perhaps he did, and the record doesn't survive, who knows. But I think the conclusion that I would reach is that Cavendish does refer to sodomy in his poem, but we would need further sources like this to credibly argue that George had same-sex relationships. So can we say that George had same-sex affairs based on Cavendish's poem alone? No, not really.
Yeah, so fascinating. And I think it shows how crucial it is to look at these sources, obviously extremely closely, but also within the context of the period where they were created as well, because of those nuances in the language that you've mentioned. So that was really, really interesting. I have one more question for you. You've been so generous already with your expertise and time. You mentioned earlier, of course, that sodomy went largely unpunished for all those reasons that it can't be spoken about in medieval and Tudor time. So why does this eventually change then?
Yeah, so this is largely what my PhD is about. And I guess my main argument is that post 1688 stands out as the period in which sodomy entered the public sphere on a level not before seen in English history. And by that, I mean in literature, satire, and court cases, which, like we've covered, hadn't really happened before. So I suggest that this happened because of the sodomy accusations against William III, who became king in 1689 following the Glorious Revolution, during which he deposed his Catholic father-in-law, James II. William then ruled jointly with his wife, Mary II, but she died in 1694. And after this, he didn't remarry and ruled alone until his death in 1702. So importantly, the revolution wasn't just a change of monarch. It generated an emergency in the principles of government. So as part of this, diverse concepts of political power vied to encapsulate the newly fragmented feelings of allegiance. So pro-Williamite and anti-Williamite propaganda emerged as a result of these divisions. So anti-Williamite discourse, which is what I look at, challenged the legitimacy of William's monarchy and his ability to rule. So as we've discussed, sodomy was considered an unnatural and criminal form of sex. And it became weaponized against William as a way to symbolize the abnormality of his succession and the perceived corruption of his regime. So as the body politic, sexual slander against the monarch and those who had intimate access to his body could express political criticisms of the monarchy's authority and power. So these accusations against William are important because of the amount of material that was circulated and the circumstances in which they circulated. So I have collected dozens of satires that begin at the very start of William's reign in 1689 and accuse him of sodomy, most frequently with Hans Willem Bentinck, who had been his favourite for decades, but also with his younger favourite, Arnold Keppel, and actually some English courtiers too. And so these were originally written in manuscript, but spread into print as well. And they didn't merely circulate in the aristocratic circles of the royal court, but spread to a wider readership, including the army, taverns, social clubs, and coffee houses. There's also evidence that they were distributed, or maybe even produced actually, beyond English shores in the Netherlands and France. So importantly, literacy rates and the population of London in the 1690s were growing, meaning that more people would have had the capacity to read them. So there were also some satires that were sung to common tunes. So even those who couldn't read could still have access to them through hearing them being sung in coffee houses or taverns, for example. So it was also the type of sodomy that William was accused of that was different from the general view of sodomy that had gone before. He was presented as an exclusive sodomite, so someone who only had sex with men and actually rejected women. So this was quite a novel concept from the view that sodomy was a set of acts that didn't have a bearing on who a person was, like we've covered. Now there was material that said actually a man could be attracted to men and not women, destabilizing the view that all men were attracted to women and sodomy was just a sinful temptation. Many satires actually accused William of popularizing sodomy in England, saying that he turned all things artsy-versy in the country. And I think that this is representative of the idea that sodomy was actually becoming more widely spoken about in general. So following this outpour of anti-Williamite satire, an association called the Society for the Reformation of Manners was founded in Tower Hamlets in 1691. And by 1701, there were nearly 20 of these societies in London. So they were voluntary organizations that sought to purge public vice through initially targeting adultery and prostitution, but then sodomy also became a target. So the leader of the societies, Reverend Thomas Bray, became fanatical in his persecution of sodomy, which he called an evil force invading our land. A view that view was also commonly expressed in the satires that attacked William. So the societies actually arranged the first mass arrests of men who had sex with men in English history through agent provocateurs and raids on male brothels, which were known as molly houses. So these arrests, trials, and raids actually led to the suicides and executions of men that were accused of sodomy, which were then reported on in early newspapers and satirized in further poems and pamphlets, providing more publicity to sodomy. So several anti-Williamite satires actually connected the growing awareness of this subculture to notions of court sodomy, again accusing William of popularizing the vice in England. So this is because William was a foreigner. So sodomy in England was associated as a kind of like a foreign vice. So that's why William is being accused of popularizing it in England, because he's this foreign king. So this is the moment when the sodomitical subculture of London was brought to public attention for the first time in English history, which was this kind of watershed moment in shifting public views about sodomy from that kind of medieval and Tudor view. So like I've mentioned, sodomy was not thought of as a lifelong orientation or a social identity in the medieval and Tudor eras. But after the exposure of the subculture, sodomites was reported as a kind of people and spoken of as such men. So this distinguished them from men who had sex with women and classified them as not only a separate group, but a separate kind of being. They were also further reported as gangs of them who associate themselves together and participate in shared rituals. So reports also highlighted how these men called themselves the Mollies and Sisters, meaning that these communities had a shared culture of language, which is, this kind of key factor in creating a sense of community and identity. The reports also highlighted that these groups of men had been meeting for a long time before they were discovered by the societies, highlighting that this is just the point at which they were exposed, not the point at which these meetings between men who had sex with men actually began. So the notion of sexual exclusivity between men also became further cemented with the exposure of these communities. So like I mentioned, anti-Williamite satire presented William III as an exclusive sodomite who abandoned sexual activity with women. So the sodomites that were exposed by the societies were presented in a similar way. So in an early newspaper called the Post Angel, for example, reported in 1701 that those who have been executed for catamiting proves that some one man may have a greater passion for a catamite than a female. So catamite was another word for sodomite, essentially. Additional satires and broadside ballads, such as the Women Haters' Lamentation, for example, from 1707, went further and accused sodomites of being wholly attracted to their own sex and of hating women. So this was a common thing. Sodomites were then presented as women haters, essentially, throughout the 18th century. So the exposure of the subculture not only revealed that sodomites did have communitarian elements based on shared space, language, and distinctive customs, but the sexual exclusivity between men was a real thing, challenging that Tudor and medieval view which had gone before. So these ideas were so new and outlandish that Daniel Defoe referred to the men exposed by the societies as our modern sodomites, and further referred to them as the new sodomitish crew. So this is really a key moment in the history of sexuality. I think the moment really when modern ideas of sexuality start to emerge and the point at which the persecution of these men actually begins, which would last for centuries. So the first arrest that societies arranged took place in 1698, and the executions begin not long after that. So the last execution in England took place in 1835, which was that of James Pratt and John Smith. So the lasting impact of this was very, very long and quite big.
Yeah, the brutality of the past never ceases to amaze me, I have to say, and continues to this day, doesn't it, in many ways? But oh my goodness, that was so fascinating. So, Jack, I'm sure that people want to know more about your work, want to follow along. Is there anywhere that they can go to kind of follow what you're doing, anywhere online?
Yes, I have Twitter and Blue Sky. So I post on there. I need to do more posting, to be honest. Of my
Busy
work.
working on your PhD, I imagine. Well, I'll add links to those, to the show notes, to make it nice and easy for everyone to find you. But the final question I have for you, of course, is the Tudor takeaway. So this is something I ask all my guests for, something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
I do. So it's Gareth Russell's new book called Queen James. I read it recently and reviewed it for History Today. And it's just, I think, how queer history should be written. It was just absolutely brilliant. So I would recommend, if anyone wants to, I guess, know more about sodomy in the Tudor period, go and read that book. It's brilliant.
Oh, I'm waiting for my copy to arrive. It hasn't arrived yet. And look, we're all massive fans of Gareth Russell on Talking Tudors. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I have seen really great reviews of it. So that's really wonderful. And I have to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk Tudors with us. So thank you, Jack.
No, thank you for having me. Thanks.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You're You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.